There is a cave in the Bolivian Andes, at 4,000 meters above sea level, that archaeologists almost overlooked. Inside, they found a pouch stitched together from 3 fox snouts. Inside that pouch, carved wooden tablets, a snuffing tube braided with human hair, and traces of at least 5 different psychoactive substances. The pouch belonged to someone who died roughly 1,000 years ago. The substances inside it came from plants that don't even grow in that region. Cocaine from the lowlands, harmine, a key ingredient in ayahuasca from the Amazon jungle. Someone had assembled this kit from across an entire continent, which means that 1,000 years ago, someone thought it was worth crossing thousands of miles of mountains and jungle just to get the right combination of substances. This is not the exception. This is the pattern. Every human civilization we have ever studied, without a single known exception, has found a way to alter its own consciousness. The ancient Sumerians called opium hul-gil, which translates roughly as joy plant, and they were cultivating it at least 5,000 years ago. The Egyptians used cannabis in religious ceremonies. The Greeks drank wine mixed with substances modern pharmacologists are still trying to identify. The Aztecs used mushrooms they called flesh of the gods. The question is not why humans started using drugs. The question is why we ever thought we wouldn't. For most of human history, this wasn't considered a problem. It was considered a technology, a way to speak to the dead, to numb pain, to mark transitions, to pull a community together around something larger than themselves. The idea that these substances are inherently dangerous, inherently criminal, inherently outside the bounds of normal human behavior, is extraordinarily recent. And the story of how we got from flesh of the gods to war on drugs is one of the stranger journeys in human history. I was researching something entirely different, ancient trade routes, when I kept running into the same thing. Everywhere goods moved across the ancient world, drugs moved with them, not as contraband, as currency, as medicine, as proof that you had access to something rare and powerful. So I went deeper. For most of human history, psychoactive substances occupied the same cultural space as fire or iron, sacred, controlled, deliberate tools, and the people who controlled them held real power. In ancient Mesopotamia, the poppy appears on clay tablets dating to around 3,400 BCE, among the oldest written records we have. Opium wasn't just medicinal, it was woven into ritual. Priests administered it. Temples stored it. The line between pharmacy and temple didn't exist yet because no one had thought to draw it. Here's the strange part. When archaeologists in 2021 examined residue from a ritual vessel at a Bronze Age site in Spain, connected to the Eleusinian Mysteries, the most prestigious religious initiation in the ancient Greek world, they found ergot alkaloids. Ergot is a fungus that grows on grain, and some researchers have long speculated it may have been the active ingredient in the ritual drink kykeon. The research team was led by archaeochemist Jordi Roll at the University of Barcelona. If they're right, the ceremonies that Plato attended, the rituals that arguably shaped the philosophical tradition of the Western world, may have been built around a chemically induced experience that most governments today would classify as illegal. Nobody in ancient Greece thought this was strange, because nobody had yet been told it should be, but someone was about to tell them. This was the point where I expected the story to become simpler. It didn't. The transformation didn't happen because drugs got more dangerous. It happened because enormous amounts of money got involved, and empires followed the money. By the late 18th century, the British East India Company had a problem. They were buying vast quantities of Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. But China wasn't interested in much of what Britain had to sell. The trade balance was bleeding silver out of Britain at an alarming rate. So the company found a solution. Opium, grown in Bengal, shipped to Chinese merchants along the coast. It worked extraordinarily well. Within decades, an estimated 2 million Chinese people were dependent. The Qing Emperor sent a letter to Queen Victoria in 1839, a direct personal appeal, pointing out that Britain was poisoning his people for profit and asking her to stop. Victoria did not reply. Instead, China's Imperial Commissioner Lin Zexu seized and destroyed over 1,000 tons of British opium stocks in Canton. The British response was to send warships. Let that settle for a moment. The First Opium War ended in 1842 with China ceding Hong Kong and forced to open 5 ports to foreign trade. The second, in 1860, extracted even more. Britain fought 2 wars, not to stop drug trafficking, to protect it, and won both. By the 1830s, historian Julia Lovell estimates in her 2011 book, The Opium War, opium accounted for roughly 15 to 20% of all East India Company exports. Empires usually prefer to call it trade when they're the ones doing the trafficking. This is not a metaphor. This is bookkeeping. But you don't need an empire to end up inside something you didn't choose. Now forget empires for a moment. Forget trade routes and colonial policy. In 1897, a young German chemist named Heinrich Dresser was working for Bayer, the same company that makes aspirin, when he synthesized a new compound derived from morphine. It was stronger, faster acting, and according to early trials, it didn't seem to cause dependency the way morphine did. Bayer named it heroin, trademarked, launched commercially in 1898, marketed as a cough suppressant and, for a brief window, as a treatment for morphine addiction. This is not a footnote. This is how a pharmaceutical company introduced heroin to the mass market, advertised it in medical journals across Europe and America, and sold it in bottles alongside aspirin and cold remedies. Parents gave it to children for coughs. Physicians prescribed it freely. By the time the dependency patterns became impossible to ignore, roughly a decade later, millions of people were already inside something they hadn't seen coming. None of them had been looking for drugs. They had been looking for relief. The distinction, at the time, was considered obvious. And once someone decided who the real problem was, the solution was obvious too. In the early 20th century, something interesting happened to the language around drugs. They stopped being substances and started being people. Opium became Chinese immigrants in California. Cocaine became, through deliberate newspaper campaigns, black men in the American South. Cannabis became Mexican migrant workers. Harry Anslinger, the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, told Congress in 1937 that marijuana caused white women to seek sexual relations with black men. This is a direct quote from congressional testimony. That led directly to the Marijuana Tax Act of the same year. The science didn't drive the legislation. The science was barely consulted. By 1971, President Nixon made the logic explicit, though it took decades for anyone to admit it. His domestic policy chief John Ehrlichman, in a 2016 interview published in Harper's Magazine, described the strategy plainly. The Nixon White House had 2 enemies: the anti-war left and black people. Associate the left with marijuana, black people with heroin, criminalize both heavily, and you could disrupt those communities without ever mentioning race or politics directly. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Ehrlichman said. Of course we did. A tool used across 40,000 years of human history had been reframed, in less than a century, as an enemy of civilization. The cave in Bolivia, with its fox snout pouch, is now in a museum, behind glass, labeled and cataloged. The shaman who assembled it, crossing a continent for the right combination of plants, is a data point in an academic paper. Somewhere in that distance is the whole story. We didn't fall into a complicated relationship with psychoactive substances recently. We were born into it. What changed over the last 200 years wasn't the chemistry. It was who got to decide what the chemistry meant, who it belonged to, who it threatened, who it made rich, and who it put in a cell. The fox snout pouch predates all of that by 900 years. It didn't come with a warning label either.